Memphis, late 1960s. He was the brightest star on earth, adored by millions, but behind the glare of the spotlights, Elvis Presley felt a gnawing emptiness. Fame had given him everything, except the simple warmth of belonging. One evening, away from the stage and the crowds, Elvis heard about a small children's home on the edge of town. No cameras, no grand announcements, just a quiet decision to walk through those doors as an ordinary man. What happened next, no one could have scripted. The children froze, staring at him as though he were a figure who had stepped out of a dream. Then, suddenly, a boy no older than 6 broke free from the group, ran straight across the room, and threw his arms around Elvis's neck. The words the boy spoke in that moment silenced everyone, including Presley himself. It was not a request for an autograph, not a plea for a song, but something far more raw, a desperate question that pierced Elvis to his very core. That embrace would mark the beginning of a story the public never knew. A journey that revealed not the king of rock and roll, but the vulnerable man who carried scars of his own childhood, and the promise he could not turn away from. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer air in Memphis that afternoon carried a heavy stillness, the kind of warmth that slowed every movement, making the sound of cicadas outside all the more persistent. The orphanage stood on a quiet street, a building that looked tired but not unloved. Its brick walls bore the stains of time, its windows framed by faded curtains that had once been white. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of overcooked vegetables from the cafeteria, mingled with the faint sweetness of crayons and glue from the children's activity room. The furniture was old, scuffed from decades of use. Wooden chairs creaked under the slightest weight, and the linoleum on the floors was worn so thin that the original patterns had long disappeared. Yet, despite the modest surroundings, there was a warmth. The sound of children laughing and running echoed through the halls, colliding with the occasional scolding voice of a caretaker trying to restore order. Into this ordinary setting walked a man who seemed to carry a different kind of atmosphere with him. Elvis Presley had not arrived in a limousine or with an entourage. No television crews followed him. No photographers lurked at the gate. He had come alone, in a battered Cadillac that blended into the Memphis streets. He wore blue jeans, a simple checkered shirt with rolled-up sleeves, and dark sunglasses. The hair was unmistakable, though. The familiar wave, carefully combed, yet not styled for a stage. To the children, he might have seemed like a figure they had seen in magazines, but surely not here, not in their world. He pushed open the wooden door, its hinges groaning, and stepped inside. For a moment, no one noticed. The children were busy chasing one another down the corridor, clutching marbles and paper airplanes. The caretakers were preoccupied with keeping order. Elvis stood still, his tall frame filling the doorway, and took in the scene with a quiet gaze. He wasn't smiling yet. He looked as though he was trying to steady his own nerves. This wasn't a concert hall or a hotel suite. It was a place where every pair of eyes would see him not as the king, but as a man. When the first boy finally spotted him, the reaction wasn't what Elvis might have expected. "Hey," the boy whispered to his friend, tugging at his sleeve. "That guy looks like Elvis." The friend squinted, skeptical. "Nah, Elvis doesn't wear jeans. That's just some fella trying to look like him." A ripple of curiosity passed through the room as more children turned to stare. Some giggled, whispering to each other. A girl pointed boldly and asked, "Are you supposed to be him?" Her tone carried both suspicion and mischief. Elvis slowly removed his sunglasses and tucked them into his shirt pocket. His eyes, blue and direct, met theirs without a hint of performance. "I reckon I'm just me," he said softly, his voice calm, with that Memphis drawl that carried the music of the South. A hush fell over the room. The caretakers exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a neatly pinned bun, stepped forward. She seemed uneasy, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Presley, is it really you? We weren't told you'd be visiting. Usually there are arrangements, papers, official letters." She was flustered, tugging at the hem of her cardigan. Elvis gave her a gentle nod. "No papers. No arrangements. I just wanted to stop by." His words hung in the air, simple but disarming. The caretaker's eyes widened. She seemed almost alarmed by the casualness of it all. Celebrities didn't just walk in unannounced. There were rules, procedures, expectations. She opened her mouth as if to protest further, but before she could, something unexpected happened. From the far side of the room, a small boy with tousled hair and thin shoulders broke free from the crowd of children. He moved quickly, almost recklessly, dodging past the others as though nothing could stop him. His little shoes slapped against the worn floor as he charged straight toward Elvis. The caretakers gasped, trying to catch him, but he slipped through their arms. Before Elvis could react, the boy leapt forward and wrapped his arms tightly around his waist, pressing his face into the fabric of his shirt. The force of it nearly knocked Elvis a step back. Silence swept through the room. Every pair of eyes froze on the boy clinging to him. And then the child spoke, his voice trembling but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You're my daddy now, right?" The words hit like a lightning strike. For a moment, even Elvis seemed stunned, his body stiffening as though the floor beneath him had shifted. The room, once filled with chatter and whispers, was now so still that even the distant hum of the ceiling fan sounded deafening. The boy's arms clutched tighter, as if afraid that Elvis might vanish if he let go. Elvis slowly lowered his hand, resting it gently on the boy's back. He didn't speak right away. His throat had tightened too much for words. His eyes, though, betrayed the storm inside him. Surprise, sorrow, something raw that he couldn't mask even if he wanted to. The caretakers looked helpless, unsure of what to do. Some of the children stared wide-eyed, while others smiled, thinking it was a game. But Elvis knew it was not a game. The desperation in that child's voice was something he recognized, a hunger not for food or toys, but for someone to stay, for someone to belong to. He bent slightly, meeting the boy's eyes as the small face lifted toward him. The child's gaze was earnest, pleading, and too old for his years. Elvis's heart clenched. In that single moment, the man who had filled stadiums, who had been seen by millions on television, who had heard every kind of applause imaginable, realized he had never stood in a place where words mattered more than they did now. The boy whispered again, softer this time, almost like a prayer. "Please don't leave." Elvis swallowed hard, unable to answer right away. Around them, the orphanage seemed to fade. The peeling paint, the worn chairs, the smell of the cafeteria. There was only this fragile human connection, raw and undeniable. And though no one else in the room could quite grasp what had just happened, Elvis knew in his soul that this moment would stay with him far longer than any ovation. The room where the children gathered after lessons was plain, but filled with small traces of life. The wooden floor groaned with every step, its boards uneven from decades of running feet. Faded drawings covered the walls, stick figures holding balloons, crooked houses with chimneys, suns drawn far too big. There was a shelf stacked with worn toys, puzzles missing pieces, a teddy bear missing an ear, and a jumble of dominoes that no longer formed a full set. Yet the children carried these things like treasures, because they were all they had. Elvis sat down on one of the creaky chairs, the boy still holding onto his hand, unwilling to let go. The caretakers had given up trying to separate them. One of them quietly gestured for the other children to gather around. But they didn't need prompting. They moved closer on their own, some kneeling on the floor, some perching on desks, eyes fixed on him as though waiting for a story. The boy finally spoke again, introducing himself in a shy, hurried voice. "My name's Jimmy," he said, his words softened by a southern twang. "Mama. She got sick a few weeks ago. They brought me here after he hesitated, then added with a blunt honesty that children often have, 'I never had no daddy.' Not once." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Elvis had expected. Jimmy wasn't crying. He spoke as if it was simply a fact of life, but the weight of those words pressed down on the room like a sudden chill. Elvis leaned back slightly, staring at the boy, and something shifted inside him. In Jimmy's small, tired face, he saw echoes of his own past. Memories stirred. The tiny shotgun house in Tupelo, the cracked walls, the damp winters, the sense of always being on the edge of losing everything. He thought of his mother, Gladys, whose love had been his entire world, and of that August morning in 1958 when she was taken from him. Even years later, the wound never closed. Fame had not healed it. Success had only made it sharper, because there were too many nights when he stood on stage hearing thousands cheer, yet knew that the one voice he longed for would never return. Looking at Jimmy, Elvis felt as though he was staring at a reflection of his younger self, a child clutching at something solid in a world that felt like it might collapse at any moment. His chest tightened, and for a second he had to turn his gaze away to steady himself. The children, sensing a softness in him, began to draw closer still. One little boy pushed a wrinkled drawing into Elvis's lap, a picture of a stick man with a guitar. "That's you," the boy said proudly, though it looked like nothing more than a lopsided figure with oversized hair. Elvis chuckled, the sound low and unforced, and patted the child's head. Another girl tugged at his sleeve, her hair tied in crooked braids. "Will you sing us something?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. He hesitated. Singing here felt different. This wasn't a stage. There was no orchestra waiting, no spotlight, no audience expecting a polished performance. These were children asking from a place of innocence, not spectacle. He thought for a moment, then softly began humming a tune, not one of his big hits, but a simple gospel melody his mama used to hum when he was a boy. The notes floated gently, imperfectly, but they carried a warmth that filled the room. The children leaned in, listening with rapt attention. When he finished, the room remained hushed, as if no one dared break the spell. Then a small burst of applause came, awkward but sincere, and the children's faces lit up. For them, it wasn't about the fame or the voice. It was about the fact that he had shared something real, something personal. Jimmy, still at his side, didn't clap. Instead, he tugged on Elvis's sleeve and whispered, almost conspiratorially, "You sound like Mama when she sang in the kitchen." The words hit Elvis harder than any ovation he'd ever received. He had to swallow before answering, his voice hoarse. "That's the best thing anyone's ever told me, son." As the children began to chatter again, showing him more of their drawings, pointing out which toys were theirs, one girl suddenly spoke up, her voice clear and direct. "You'll come back tomorrow, won't you?" The question stopped him cold. It wasn't a demand, just a simple expectation spoken without hesitation. To the girl, it was as natural as asking if the sun would rise. Yet to Elvis, it landed like a weight he hadn't anticipated. He could feel all the children's eyes turning to him, waiting for his answer. In their world, adults often came and went. Social workers, volunteers, sometimes even relatives who promised visits that never happened. The idea of someone leaving was familiar, almost expected. But in this moment, with their trust hanging in the air, Elvis realized what they wanted from him wasn't an autograph or a song. They wanted him to stay. His pulse quickened. He thought of his schedule, the constant pull of rehearsals, contracts, Las Vegas residencies. His life was built on coming and going, never standing still. Yet here, in this modest room with peeling wallpaper and broken toys, he felt a pull stronger than any audience roar. He forced a smile, though inside he was uncertain. "I'll do my best," he said gently. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew doing his best wouldn't be enough. For children like these, half-promises were the same as abandonment. He felt the responsibility sink into his bones, heavier than the golden records that lined his walls back at Graceland. Jimmy tightened his grip on his hand, as though sealing an unspoken agreement. Elvis didn't resist. He let the boy hold on, because, in truth, he needed that touch as much as the child did. In the echo of that simple question, "You'll come back tomorrow, won't you?" Elvis understood something profound. This visit could not be a passing kindness. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would demand more of him than fame, fortune, or music ever had. And though he didn't yet know how, he felt deep in his soul that he could not walk away from it. The days that followed were unlike anything Elvis had planned. What began as a single unannounced stop turned into a quiet routine. Every few afternoons, when his schedule allowed, he drove back to the orphanage. He never told his manager, never alerted the press. He came dressed the same way. Jeans, simple shirts, sometimes a jacket if the weather turned cool. Each time, the children ran to the door as if waiting for him. For them, there was no hesitation anymore. He wasn't a figure from a magazine. He had become part of their days, as ordinary as the meals in the cafeteria or the bedtime prayers. But outside the orphanage walls, whispers began. A reporter caught sight of him one morning leaving the building, his head lowered, trying to move unnoticed. Within a week, word spread in Memphis. Elvis Presley keeps showing up at the orphanage on Jackson Avenue. At first, it sounded like gossip. Then local papers began to call, asking the director for confirmation. The director, Mr. Hollis, was a cautious man in his 50s, balding and meticulous, who had kept the orphanage running on slim budgets and strict rules. He admired generosity, but he feared spectacle. Sitting across from Elvis in his office, a narrow room with filing cabinets stuffed with papers and a cross hanging on the wall, Hollis voiced his concern. "Mr. Presley, I don't doubt your heart," he began, his voice polite but edged with unease. "But publicity is a dangerous thing for these children. They are not a show. The wrong kind of attention could hurt more than it helps." Elvis listened, arms folded, his expression serious. He knew the man was right in principle. Fame had always been a double-edged sword. "Still," he answered firmly, "I didn't bring cameras. I'm not here for photographs. I just wanted to spend time with them." Hollis leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And what happens when you stop coming? When the tours call you back? When the spotlight takes you elsewhere? These children don't survive well with loss. Every adult who vanishes from their lives leaves a scar. Can you carry that, Mr. Presley?" The words dug deep. Elvis had thought about it in passing, but now the weight of it was laid bare. His silence stretched long enough that Hollis finally looked away, almost regretful for having said it so plainly. Later that afternoon, out in the yard, Jimmy tugged at Elvis's sleeve as they walked beneath a tree whose branches stretched like tired arms over the playground. The boy's face was unusually serious, his voice quiet but piercing. "Are you gonna leave too? Like all the others?" The question struck harder than any headline or lecture could. Elvis stopped in his tracks, staring down at him. The boy's eyes weren't angry. They were searching, pleading, as if trying to read the truth before it was spoken. Around them, the other children played, shouting and chasing balls. But for Elvis, the world had narrowed to this single voice, this single soul demanding an answer. He knelt to Jimmy's level, resting a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. His own voice wavered despite his best effort to steady it. "I don't plan on leaving you, son. Not if I can help it." Jimmy studied him as though testing whether the words could be trusted. Then he gave a small nod, but his hand still clung to Elvis's wrist, reluctant to let go. That touch was heavier than any contract Elvis had ever signed. As the days went by, the visits drew more attention. A photographer appeared at the gates once, trying to snap a picture. Elvis turned his back, shielding the children, refusing to be part of the scene. But whispers grew louder. Why was he there? What did it mean? Some praised him, others doubted his motives. One evening, sitting alone at Graceland after returning from the orphanage, Elvis stared at a framed picture of his mama. Her smile in the photograph was soft, proud, full of the same kind of love he had seen reflected in Jimmy's eyes. He felt the weight of his own promises pressing down on him. Fame had never asked for his honesty. Contracts never cared about his soul. But these children, they wanted only one thing: for him not to vanish. The next morning, he returned once more, greeted by a chorus of shouts and laughter that rose above the creak of the playground swings. And though the noise and energy of the children wrapped around him like a wave, he still heard that single question echoing in his head. "Are you gonna leave too?" He knew now the answer could not be spoken lightly. To them, he was no longer a guest. He was becoming something far more dangerous, someone they believed in. And belief, Elvis realized, was a responsibility that might change the course of his life. By late summer, Elvis's visits had become almost a fixture of the orphanage. The staff had grown used to the sight of him crouching in the yard to tie a child's shoelace, or carrying boxes of donated food into the kitchen. He brought baseball gloves, a set of jump ropes, even a small guitar that he placed into Jimmy's eager hands. For the children, he was no longer a surprise guest. He was simply there, woven into their days like the sound of the evening bell that called them to supper. But the outside world had begun to notice. One morning, a copy of the Memphis Press Scimitar landed on the director's desk. The headline read in bold, "Presley's Orphanage Visits, Charity or Publicity." Beneath it, a photograph, grainy but recognizable, showed Elvis walking across the orphanage yard, his hair wind-swept, Jimmy clutching his hand. The article hinted at motives, questioning whether the king of rock and roll was using vulnerable children to polish his image. The words carried a sting, insinuating that sincerity could not exist without performance. When Elvis saw the clipping later that day, his jaw tightened. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles whitening. He had come quietly, with no cameras, no fanfare. Yet here it was, twisted into something cheap. That evening, at Graceland, his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, stormed into the music room holding the same article. His face was flushed, his voice sharp. "Elvis, What in heaven's name are you doing? You can't be sneaking around orphanages without telling me. This is bad business. You want to help? Fine. Cut a check, set up a foundation, put your name on a plaque. That's how it's done. But this? Running around holding orphans' hands? It looks like a stunt. Elvis slammed his hand down on the piano lid, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. A stunt? He shot back, his voice trembling with anger. You think sitting with those kids, listening to 'em, is a stunt? That boy looks at me like I'm the first man who ain't walked out on him. That's not business, Colonel. That's real life. Parker threw up his hands. Real life doesn't sell records. Real life gets you headlines like this one. You're building trouble, son, and trouble don't pay. The argument ended in silence, Elvis pacing the room, his fists clenched. The colonel didn't understand. Maybe he never would. The next day, Elvis returned to the orphanage, but the children's mood was different. A few of them crowded around, as usual, eager to show him drawings or to hear him sing. Yet Jimmy's question came first, his small voice edged with confusion. Why do the papers say you're only here to show off? The words cut deeper than Parker's shouting had. Elvis knelt down, searching the boy's face. He saw doubt flickering there, like a candle struggling against the wind. That doubt frightened him more than any newspaper headline. I don't care what the papers say, Jimmy, Elvis replied softly. I came for you, for all of you. Not for them, but convincing a child was harder than silencing a critic. Trust, once shaken, trembled dangerously. The other children listened closely, their eyes questioning too. For them, the world had always been a place where promises cracked and adults vanished. And now the newspapers seemed to suggest that even Elvis might not be what he appeared. That evening, after the children went to bed, Elvis stayed behind with the caretaker, Mrs. Reynolds. She poured him coffee in a chipped mug, her hands weary but kind. They read everything, you know, she said quietly. Even if they don't understand all the words, they catch the meaning. They've been abandoned enough to know how it feels. When trust slips, Elvis stared into the dark liquid, his reflection broken in its surface. I never wanted to hurt him, he whispered. I know, she answered gently, but if you keep coming, you have to prove it's not just for a season. They've had enough seasons of people leaving. The words stayed with him as he drove back through the Memphis night, the neon lights of diners blurring past his windshield. He thought of the crowds he had faced on stage, tens of thousands screaming his name. That had always felt like proof of something, proof that he mattered. Yet here, in this small orphanage, he discovered a truth that unsettled him more than any critic. Applause was easy, but faith was fragile. He realized then that the children didn't need another benefactor dropping gifts from a distance. They needed consistency, presence, something steady in a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. And if he was going to stay in their lives, even for a while, he would have to offer more than songs or toys. He would have to offer himself. But at what cost? That question lingered like smoke as he pulled into the Graceland driveway, the mansion looming quiet in the dark. For the first time, Elvis wondered whether his life as the king and his need to be simply a man could survive in the same body. The orphanage had an old chapel tucked at the far end of the property, a building most visitors never saw. Its wooden frame sagged with age, the stained glass windows dulled by years of dust and neglect. Yet when the children entered, they treated the place with a reverence beyond their years. It wasn't grandeur that gave it weight, but memory. Countless whispered prayers, hymns sung off-key, small hands folded together in hope. One late evening, Elvis lingered after supper instead of leaving. The children had begged him to stay a little longer, and he couldn't bring himself to disappoint them. As dusk fell, Mrs. Reynolds unlocked the chapel and let them inside. The glow of candles scattered across the altar bathed the space in warm flickers, shadows rising and falling against the wooden beams overhead. The air smelled faintly of wax and old hymnals. Elvis sat down at the piano tucked against the wall, its paint chipped, a few keys yellowed. He pressed a note gently. The sound was thin but honest, carrying across the quiet space. The children settled around him, cross-legged on the floor, their chatter fading into stillness. For a long moment, he said nothing. His fingers rested on the keys as if he were unsure whether to begin. This was no concert hall. There was no band to back him, no roar of a crowd demanding a hit. Here, he was stripped of costume and title, faced only with expectant eyes. Then, almost without deciding, he began to play. The melody was slow, familiar. An old gospel hymn he had sung with his mother in their tiny house in Tupelo. His voice came low at first, unadorned, carrying the weariness of memory. But as he sang, the sound grew warmer, filling the room like a tide. The children listened, wide-eyed, as though hearing something sacred. It wasn't the polish of his records they heard. It was raw, trembling, full of history and longing. The candlelight caught his face, revealing not the star the world knew, but a son singing to his mother across time. When the final note lingered into silence, no one moved. Then a small voice rose from the floor. Jimmy, seated closest to the piano, opened his mouth and sang the chorus back to him. His tone was untrained but piercing, clear as glass. The sound startled even Elvis, who turned to watch in disbelief. The boy sang with a depth no child his age should have carried. His voice cracked once, but instead of faltering, it grew stronger, vibrating with something more powerful than skill. Pain transformed into music. The other children gasped, then fell completely silent. Elvis's chest tightened. He recognized it instantly. The sound of grief searching for release. It was the same sound he had once made, years ago, standing alone after Gladys died, when singing was the only way he could keep breathing. When Jimmy finished, the chapel remained still, except for the faint crackle of a candle wick. A tear slid down Mrs. Reynolds's cheek. One of the girls clapped her hands together once, then stopped, sensing the moment required more than applause. Elvis reached out and pulled Jimmy gently toward him, setting the boy on the piano bench beside him. His own voice was husky. "You've got something in you, son." Don't you ever hide that Jimmy's eyes shone, not with pride, but with the relief of being seen. For a child who had lost so much, that recognition was more valuable than any gift. He leaned into Elvis's side, whispering, "When I sing, I don't feel so empty." The words unraveled something inside Elvis. He placed his arm around the boy, his throat too tight to answer. In Jimmy's honesty, he heard his own story mirrored back. A reminder of the boy he had once been, clinging to music as the only light in a darkened room. The other children began humming the hymn softly, their voices blending in uneven harmony. Some swayed, others clasped hands. Soon, the chapel was alive with sound. Imperfect, fragile, but full of belonging. Elvis closed his eyes, letting their voices wash over him. For a moment, he felt lifted out of himself, as though time had folded, and he was both the child and the man, singing in unison with the past. When the last note faded, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with meaning, a silence that held more than words could. As they left the chapel, Jimmy clung to Elvis's side. The night air outside was cool, carrying the scent of grass and distant rain. The children scattered toward their dormitories, their laughter subdued, as if they understood something profound had occurred. Elvis lingered a moment at the chapel door, staring back at the dim glow of candles through the windows. He realized what had just taken place was not entertainment, not even comfort. It was communion. Not in the church sense alone, but in the truest form of souls meeting without walls between them. And for the first time in years, Elvis felt stripped of the loneliness that fame had built around him. In that small chapel, surrounded by children with nothing, he had found a fullness that Graceland, with all its chandeliers and gilded halls, had never given him. As he walked toward his car, Jimmy's small hand still wrapped in his, Elvis knew this night would never leave him. It was more than a visit. It was a turning point, and he could no longer deny it. His life had become bound to theirs. Autumn crept into Memphis with cool winds and leaves that gathered in brittle piles along the sidewalks. The orphanage grounds, once bright with children chasing each other in the summer sun, were now littered with fallen branches and the sharp scent of smoke from nearby chimneys. Elvis continued to visit when he could, often arriving at dusk, carrying bags of food or sitting on the porch while the children swarmed around him. By then, his presence no longer stirred surprise. He belonged to them in a way that felt natural, as though he had always been part of their lives. But one gray afternoon, the rhythm shattered. Mr. Hollis, the director, called Elvis into his office. The blinds were drawn, the desk cluttered with unopened letters. Hollis's hands trembled slightly as he gestured for him to sit. "I wish I had better news," he said, his voice low, heavy. "The city's decided to withdraw funding. They claim maintenance costs are too high. Unless something changes fast, we'll have to close by the end of the year." The words struck like a blow to the chest. Elvis leaned back, stunned. "Close? What happens to the kids?" "They'll be transferred," Hollis answered grimly. "Scattered across different facilities, most in other states. They'll lose each other. This family they've built here will be broken apart." The thought twisted Elvis's stomach. He imagined Jimmy separated from the friends who had become his brothers and sisters, sent to some distant building where no familiar face would greet him. It was too cruel, too careless. That evening, when Elvis stepped outside, the children sensed the heaviness in his stride. They surrounded him as usual, tugging at his arms, chattering about their day. But his silence betrayed him. Jimmy, sharper than most, noticed immediately. He grabbed Elvis's hand, eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" Elvis tried to force a smile, but it faltered. Before he could soften the truth, Hollis's announcement had already spread in whispers among the staff. A few children had overheard. Rumors traveled fast. Jimmy's face hardened with fear, and his small voice rose, cracking under its own weight. "You said you wouldn't leave us. You promised." The cry pierced Elvis like glass. Other children froze, staring, their own fears reflected in Jimmy's outburst. Elvis crouched down, his hands gripping the boy's shoulders. "Jimmy, listen to me. I ain't leaving. Not by choice. But they're trying to shut this place down." The boy shook his head violently, tears springing to his eyes. "No! You can't let them. You said we'd be okay." Elvis's chest ached as the words settled. A promise, once spoken, was now clashing against a system far larger than him. Yet he knew that to Jimmy, to all of them, his word was not casual. It was the thin line separating hope from despair. That night Elvis didn't drive straight back to Graceland. Instead, He sat in his car outside the orphanage long after the lights inside dimmed. The street was empty, the lampposts buzzing faintly. He replayed Jimmy's voice in his head, each syllable cutting deeper. "You said you wouldn't leave us." By midnight, he had made up his mind. He would not fight this battle with checks signed in quiet rooms or donations whispered through the colonel's office. This time, he would stand openly. The next morning, Elvis requested a meeting with city officials. His celebrity carried weight enough to secure a slot quickly. He walked into the municipal building not as a performer in sequined attire, but as a man in a plain brown jacket, hair combed back simply, no entourage at his side. The corridors smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper. He passed clerks who gawked at him, but lowered their eyes when he met their gaze. In the boardroom, the officials sat stiffly behind a long table. Their suits were dark, their expressions unreadable. One of them cleared his throat. "Mr. Presley, we appreciate your concern, but the matter is straightforward. The property is too costly to maintain. Relocation is the most practical solution." Elvis leaned forward, his hands pressed against the polished wood. His voice carried none of the stage polish, only the grit of determination. "You're not talking about numbers. You're talking about children's lives. You take 'em away from each other, you break something in 'em that don't heal." Another official shifted uncomfortably, but replied coolly, "We understand your sentiment. Unfortunately, this isn't just about funds. A developer has expressed interest in the land. It's already in negotiation." Elvis's jaw tightened. It wasn't only money. It was greed, politics, power disguised as practicality. He left the meeting with anger burning in his chest, but also with clarity. This was no longer about quiet kindness or private visits. It was a fight, and he was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Music, he knew. Crowds, he could command. But bureaucracy, land deals, faceless officials, this was a different stage altogether. As he walked out into the autumn air, Jimmy's words still echoed like a vow he could not escape. "You can't let them." For the first time in years, Elvis felt the full weight of responsibility, not for a show, not for an audience, but for a community of children who had chosen to trust him. He had stepped into their lives by chance. Now he would have to stand for them by choice. The blow had fallen, but it had also lit a fire. The municipal building smelled of cigars and old varnish, its corridors echoing with the shuffle of papers and the clipped heels of secretaries. Elvis walked through those halls as though entering foreign territory. On stage, he was never uncertain. The spotlight obeyed him, and audiences rose at a single note. But here, under the cold stare of bureaucrats, his voice carried no authority. He felt stripped bare, a man trying to defend children with nothing more than his presence. In one meeting after another, officials repeated the same refrain. The land was valuable, the structures outdated, the costs unjustifiable. Some barely looked him in the eye. One, a sharp-suited councilman with a permanent smirk, said flatly, "Mr. Presley, this isn't Graceland. Money and fame don't decide city planning." Elvis gritted his teeth. "I'm not asking for special favors. I'm asking you to see what you're about to do. Tear apart the only home these kids got." The reply came with a shrug. "They'll be housed. The state will provide. It isn't your concern." That phrase, "isn't your concern," lodged in him like a thorn. It was easy for men with polished shoes and tidy ledgers to reduce children to numbers on a page. But Elvis had looked into Jimmy's eyes, had heard him sing through grief, had felt that small hand clutch his wrist with desperate trust. Concern wasn't optional. It was unavoidable. Leaving the meeting, Elvis stepped onto the courthouse steps to find reporters waiting. Flashes burst. Questions flew. "Mr. Presley, are you fighting City Hall? Is this about publicity? Why are you so invested in this one orphanage?" He hesitated only a moment before answering. "Because those kids matter. Every one of them. And if it takes me standing here to remind folks of that, then that's what I'll do." The papers printed his words the next morning. Headlines read, "Elvis Presley challenges city over orphanage," and "Singer defends children against developers." What had begun as whispers now exploded into debate. Letters poured into newsrooms, some mocking his interference, but many praising his courage. Ordinary citizens, church groups, school teachers, families began voicing support for keeping the orphanage open. Still, the colonel was furious. In a tense meeting at Graceland, he slammed his fist on the desk. "You're making enemies in places you don't even understand." These men own the papers. They own the courts. You think your reputation can withstand a war with City Hall? Elvis leaned forward, his voice sharp but steady. "This ain't about my reputation. It's about those children. You think I can walk away now? Look that boy in the eye and tell him I gave up, 'cause it was inconvenient?" The colonel fell silent, sensing a line he could no longer control. For the first time, Elvis wasn't negotiating about shows, tours, or money. He was fighting from a place the colonel couldn't manipulate, his conscience. Days turned into weeks. Elvis began calling old friends, lawyers who had once handled his contracts, pastors whose congregations respected him, even childhood acquaintances who now held sway in Memphis circles. At night, he pored over city records, trying to understand zoning laws and deeds, his eyes burning under the lamplight. This was no guitar and microphone. This was paperwork, signatures, and legal codes that seemed designed to smother the human heart. Yet, slowly, momentum shifted. Churches began to preach sermons about protecting the vulnerable. Local radio stations aired segments about the orphanage, spurred by Elvis's stand. A group of mothers started a petition drive, their voices loud enough that even the council chambers could not ignore them. And in the middle of it all, Elvis kept showing up at the orphanage. He didn't want the children to feel abandoned while he fought battles in offices they would never see. Sometimes he came exhausted, still in the clothes he'd worn to City Hall, but he always found the strength to sit with Jimmy, to listen to the girls sing clumsy hymns, to toss a ball in the yard. It grounded him, reminded him why he was enduring the public fight. One night, after another fruitless meeting with officials, Elvis lingered on the porch of the orphanage. Jimmy sat beside him, legs swinging, silent for once. After a long pause, the boy spoke. "They're really trying to take us away, ain't they?" Elvis looked at him, the streetlight casting shadows across his tired face. "They're trying. But I'm not letting 'em win easy." Jimmy's small shoulders straightened, as though his own resolve had been lit by Elvis's words. "Then I'll fight too." The simplicity of that declaration stirred something deep. Elvis realized this wasn't just about protecting children from loss. It was about teaching them that their voices mattered, that even the smallest could stand tall when someone believed in them. By the time Elvis drove away that night, he understood that the battle had grown beyond him. He wasn't alone anymore. The people of Memphis, the very city that had raised him, were beginning to rise with him. And for the first time since stepping into that orphanage, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the king could still win a war off stage. The news of the orphanage's uncertain future had already spread beyond Memphis. Neighbors whispered about it in grocery stores, Church congregations prayed aloud for the children, and the local papers printed updates almost daily. The children, though shielded as best as possible, felt the tension in every adult conversation, in the hushed tones of the staff, in the way Elvis sometimes arrived with weary eyes. One Saturday afternoon, under a pale autumn sky, Elvis came to the orphanage with a guitar slung over his shoulder. He hadn't told anyone his plan. He simply walked into the yard, where the children were scattered in small groups, some playing marbles, others sitting quietly with books too worn to read easily. He clapped his hands together once, a soft grin tugging at his lips. "Y'all mind if I borrow your attention a while?" The children looked up, startled, then rushed toward him. The caretakers, caught off guard, watched from the porch as Elvis pulled a chair into the middle of the yard. He settled the guitar on his knee, strummed a chord, and the sound rang out, raw and unamplified, floating into the cool air. "I figured," he said, "before things get too heavy, we ought to sing a little." Music makes the hard things lighter, don't it? The first song he played was simple, a country tune from his early days, the kind that spoke of dusty roads and long nights. His voice was softer than in concert, unforced, intimate. The children gathered close, some sitting cross-legged in the grass, others leaning against each other. For them, this wasn't Elvis Presley, the superstar. This was just a man singing to them, for them. As the last chord faded, a voice rang out from the group. Jimmy stepped forward, hesitant at first, then with growing courage. Can I sing with you?" Elvis's eyes softened. He nodded, handing the boy a chance without hesitation. "Come on, son." Right here beside me, Jimmy climbed onto the chair's arm, balancing awkwardly, his face serious. Elvis began strumming again, this time a gospel song the children had learned in chapel. When he sang the first line, Jimmy joined, his voice trembling at first, then finding strength. The two voices blended, one seasoned by years of pain and triumph, the other unpolished but piercingly clear. The yard grew silent except for their harmony. Even the caretakers on the porch were frozen, hands clasped over their hearts. By the second chorus, several children began humming along. The music swelled, imperfect but alive, carrying the weight of everything they feared losing. As the final note faded, Mrs. Reynolds wiped her eyes with her sleeve. A neighbor, who had wandered near the fence, held up a small Super 8 camera, capturing the moment without Elvis even noticing. That reel of film would travel further than anyone could have predicted. Within days, copies began circulating. Local journalists picked it up first, running headlines like, "Presley sings with orphans in fight for their home." Soon, national outlets followed, replaying grainy footage on television. Elvis Presley, sitting in a yard, a child at his side, singing with a tenderness that pierced through the static of the recording. Public reaction was electric. Letters flooded the mayor's office, demanding the orphanage be saved. Church groups organized rallies. Children from other schools sent hand-drawn posters, declaring solidarity with Elvis's kids. The debate had shifted. It was no longer about land or budgets. It was about conscience, about whether a city could look at the faces of its children and choose profit instead. Back at the orphanage, the children didn't fully understand the political storm gathering around them. What they understood was the music, the memory of sitting in the grass while Elvis's guitar carried their voices upward. For them, that night was less about protest and more about belonging. Jimmy, in particular, walked differently after that day. He had sung not as a boy begging for a place, but as someone standing tall beside Elvis, his voice heard by more people than he could ever imagine. It gave him a pride he had never known, a belief that he mattered. Elvis saw it too. Watching Jimmy laugh with the others afterward, he felt a fierce conviction settle in him. The fight wasn't just about keeping walls standing. It was about preserving a place where children like Jimmy could discover that their voices, however small, deserved to be heard. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the yard in amber light, Elvis put his guitar back in its case. The children crowded him with hugs, their chatter buzzing like bees. But beneath the warmth of that moment, he knew this might be the last gathering before the city made its final decision. He lingered, memorizing their faces, the boy with scuffed shoes, the girl with ribbon unraveling from her hair, Jimmy with his defiant little grin. If the council ruled against them, this memory would be what he carried, the echo of a song sung not for stadiums, but for a handful of children in need of hope. As he drove away under the darkening sky, Elvis whispered to himself, gripping the wheel tightly, "They can take the land, but they ain't taken the spirit I saw today." What he didn't know yet was how powerful that spirit had become. Enough to move an entire city. Enough to turn the tide of a fight that seemed impossible. The day of the city council's vote arrived gray and heavy, the kind of morning when the air seemed thick with anticipation. Outside Memphis's municipal building, a crowd had already gathered. Neighbors, church leaders, parents with children hoisted on their shoulders. Some held hand-painted signs. "Save our orphanage. Children before profits." Reporters clustered near the steps, cameras balanced on their shoulders, pens scratching furiously. Inside, the council chamber filled beyond capacity. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of citizens who had come to witness what would happen. At the front, city officials shuffled papers, their faces composed but strained. They had grown accustomed to quiet sessions where votes passed with little resistance. Today was different. Today the room pulsed with expectation. Elvis entered without fanfare. No entourage, no bodyguards, just a plain suit and a steady stride. Beside him walked 3 children, including Jimmy, their small hands gripping his coat sleeves. The room stirred immediately. Whispers, flashes of cameras, a ripple of awe mixed with disbelief. Yet Elvis kept his eyes forward, guiding the children as though shielding them from the storm of attention. When the council chair called for statements, Elvis did not deliver a long speech. Instead, he rose slowly, his voice low but carrying in the hushed room. "I'm no politician," he began. "I don't speak your language of numbers and contracts. But I've sat with these kids. I've eaten at their tables. I've heard them pray at night. Pray not for toys or fame, but for someone to stay. And I'll tell you plain, if you close this place, you're not just moving children. You're breaking their hearts." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shuffling of papers. Some council members shifted uncomfortably, others avoided his gaze. Elvis could feel the skepticism lingering in the air, the weight of decisions already inked on private documents. Words alone would not shift them. So he turned to Jimmy. "Son," he said softly, guiding him forward, "would you sing that hymn we sang the other night?" Jimmy's eyes widened in fear. The chamber was packed with strangers, reporters, officials in stiff suits. But Elvis knelt, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder. "Just sing like you did in the chapel. Don't look at them. Just sing." Jimmy swallowed, then nodded. He stepped into the center of the room, his small figure dwarfed by the high ceilings and looming portraits of past mayors. For a moment, he was silent, his lips trembling. Then, in a voice pure and fragile, he began to sing. The hymn floated upward, clear as glass, every note carrying the weight of loss and the flicker of hope. The sound sliced through the noise of politics, cutting straight into the room's heart. By the second verse, his voice steadied, filling the chamber with something unshakable. The crowd behind him grew silent, the reporters lowering their cameras, their pens stilled. Even the councilmen, hardened by years of negotiations, shifted in their seats as the boy's song pierced through their defenses. When the final note fell into silence, no applause came. Not because the people were unmoved, but because the room was too overcome to respond. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elvis rose, his eyes damp but unwavering. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "that's your decision, right there. That voice. That's what you'll silence if you close these doors." The vote that followed was no longer routine. The pressure of the crowd outside, the headlines already swirling, the undeniable humanity of what had just been witnessed. It was too much to ignore. One by one, council members cast their ballots. When the result was read, a wave of relief swept the room. The orphanage would remain open. Cheers erupted from the benches. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. The children clung to each other, laughing and crying at once. Jimmy turned and threw his arms around Elvis, whispering fiercely, "You kept your promise." Elvis held him close, his heart pounding with a mix of triumph and exhaustion. He knew the fight was not entirely over. Repairs would be needed, funds raised, but the place itself was safe. The children would not be scattered. Their small family would endure. In the days that followed, Elvis quietly financed the restoration of the building. New beds, fresh paint, repaired roofs. He did it without press releases, without speeches. When asked for interviews, he spoke simply, "These children gave me more than I could ever give them. They reminded me who I am, when the world tried to make me forget." The newspapers turned the story into legend, framing him as a savior of the orphanage. But those who had been there knew the truth was quieter, humbler. It wasn't about a star rescuing children. It was about a man who listened, who showed up, who refused to let promises become empty words. For Jimmy, the moment on the council floor marked the first time in his life he had felt truly heard. For the other children, it was proof that even the smallest voices could shake the halls of power. And for Elvis, it was a reminder that the stage was not the only place where lives could be changed. As autumn deepened into winter, the orphanage lights glowed warmly against the dark nights. Inside, children laughed, sang, and dreamed as they always had. And sometimes, when the halls grew quiet, Elvis could still hear Jimmy's hymn echoing in his memory. A song that had melted the hardest of hearts and kept a fragile family whole.